We're 1 year into what most people know is the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, which in a lot of ways began with sports shutting down. The NBA shut down, and then college basketball shut down, all the NCAA tournaments and all the NCAA events shut down. And I think it was at that moment that it felt really real for a lot of Americans, is the moment that happened. And I recall that we were at the pro day for Nebraska football. We had just talked to the Nebraska coaches a couple of days before, and we were at the pro day watching Carlos and Khalil Davis and other former Huskers run and do drills. And we're talking to these guys, and I don't think any of us were wearing masks. None of us knew what was going on. All of us were talking about sanitizing our hands. It was a unique time. Evan, what are your recollections of that particular day?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remember when I was leaving Pro Day was when we saw that the College World Series had been canceled on Twitter. And it was just like, wow, that was 2 months out. And it just felt in that moment like maybe that was a hasty decision. It didn't turn out to be, but that was a shock. But yeah, the football sequence, like you mentioned, 2 days earlier, we had those round table meetings with all the Nebraska assistants. And so we could go around, and I think we tried to make stories out of that availability for months, and we had no choice, right? Like that was never a topic of discussion, was a potential shutdown. So we were just talking spring stories and things like that. And then at the pro day, yeah, I mean, I remember Carlos and Khalil just kind of being asked about what was going on. They didn't have a lot of answers. Like you said, we were talking about sanitizing our hands. If I recall, the NFL scouts that were in attendance had been called back to their respective hometowns after that event. I think Nebraska's was the last pro day that people saw in person before the shutdowns hit. And I just remember kind of milling around with some of the other media that were in attendance too, and just kind of having this talk like, this might be the last in-person sort of interview time or access that we have for a long time. Even in that moment, it kind of felt like this was the start of something. You could see the tsunami kind of getting closer to land. And sure enough, that ended up being the last in-person access we've had with the football team since then. And I just remember leaving thinking how bizarre it all was. And that the last kind of whiff of normalcy that we had was at a Nebraska pro day 1 year ago. Just insane stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I have many of the same recollections as you. I was there with you that day, and certainly thought that things were going to change somewhat significantly from a sports perspective. I think recruiting shut down maybe the next day. Then Nebraska sort of postponed its spring football practice. Remember that we weren't sure if they were going to play the spring game. You remember that Nebraska was like, well, for now we're going to postpone it. We might still play it. And then it became, well, we're not going to play it. And then it's like, well, we don't know. We're going to come back, so on and so forth. So there was all these different movements and moments. I remember talking to a recruiting guy on Monday following. So it was like March 14th or 15th or something like that. And he's like, I'm in a restaurant. He's like, all the restaurants are closing tonight at 10 o'clock, and that's going to be it. Like they had these, like, we're going to impose our standards tomorrow or something. It was just such a fascinating time and moment in American history. And obviously there will be a lot to discuss as the years go on. There will, it's going to be memorable for a lot of different reasons. And as time goes on, the conversations will expand beyond even the ones that we've had in the last year. What I'll say for sports is sports was fairly resilient in all of this. And some of that might be because the sports leagues had to make money. But the NBA and Major League Baseball and NFL, they found a way to get things done. The NHL obviously is going now. The NHL did that last year as well. They found a way, and youth sports went on. I know my son played flag football in the fall. There were high school sports went on in many places. High school football wasn't played in OPS, but otherwise it was. throughout the state, and it's striking me that that's one of the industries that remained. And that's one of the things that's sort of forged forward. And it's going to be criticism for that. There's going to be people who say, "Well, that shouldn't have happened. It was inappropriate. We should have been doing other things, thinking about other things." And I respect all that, but nevertheless, it happened. And most of the sports eventually got played. You feel for the athletes who lost the opportunity to compete in the NCAA championships last year and their senior years. Simultaneously, there's been so many different opportunities in the last year that you just didn't think were necessarily possible, and now have become that. So it's certainly a sad story of what's happened with the pandemic. You've also found that through science and the development of a vaccine, there's a certain level of triumph there too. Because I remember maybe a week or a month after things started getting pretty bad, there was this, well, it's going to take 2 or 3 years for a vaccine, and that was the presumption, and we were all sort of hunkering down for what might come. And science is pretty brilliant. They were able to start producing a vaccine by November, December, and a good chunk of our population has been vaccinated now. 2 months, God willing, most of it will be.
Yeah. And from a far less, I guess, serious side of things, have you noticed now that we're starting up again? There's so many qualifiers when we talk about sports history, and as sports writers, we try to put things into context, and like even with some of this baseball stuff, it's like I have to start saying such and such over the last complete seasons because they played 15 games in 2020. We have to start qualifying everything to account for 2020 and how weird it was. It'll be the same for football when we start looking back on records and bowl appearances, and it's just eligibility. I mean, so much other stuff that is far less important than what you're talking about starts coming into play too. And I see that the Duke basketball team has had some positive COVID test and is out of the NCAA tournament. It just kind of strikes me that, man, if you would have wished a year ago as a Nebraska fan that the Huskers season would end the same time as Duke's, I guess you got what you wished for, but just not in the way that you had hoped for. So just a lot of weird minutia, I think, comes out of this year too, that's going to take a long time to kind of parse through and move on from. And that's just kind of a special thing unique to sports in some ways too. But happy to have a season back, and, we're not there yet, but we're getting closer, and hopefully by the fall, sports can be back to doing what they were supposed to do. And that's provide an outlet from things like politics and other things, as opposed to being a lightning rod for those things, which they largely have been in the last year. So
to some degree, it has been a little bit of a lightning rod. Yeah, at times, just playing the sports in general were kind of a big deal in that front. So